the divine mandate of heaven, blessings from above and beyond. When it comes to fantasy games and to the real world, religion is perhaps the greatest cornerstone of civilization and development. But in games, it can often be left falling short. But today, we're talking about building fantasy religions. Hello, everyone. My name is Kyle. I am the Dork, and that makes you fine folks the desk. And today we're going to be talking about building fantasy religions. But first, a couple things. We have a Patreon where for $10 a month, you get your own unique role-playing game that you can't get anywhere else. And once it's done for that month, it is completely gone. $10 a month gets you that. $3 a month gets you exclusive access to our content. Of course, you can get physical copies from Tabletop Bookshelf or Indie Press Revolution. And if you want digital copies of the RPGs that Desks and Dorks makes, you can get them over at itch.io. I want to go through that quickly because we are going to be discussing my favorite, and I actually do mean for once my favorite aspect of building a world, of running a game, of creating characters and making pathos work within your stories. We're talking about religion. We're going to be discussing a lot of the misconceptions about what makes a good fantasy religion versus what makes a bad one. I'm going to be talking about how to develop religions that feel organic and encourage the kind of player interaction you're looking for. And we're going to talk about how religions functioned historically as a way of sort of bootstrapping interesting and intriguing concepts within a faith. And lastly, we're going to build a religion. You, me, the comment section. Throughout this entire video, I'm going to walk you through how a faith is formed, how it is fomented, and eventually how it falls apart, or perhaps falls into something completely different. But before we go over that, I have to talk about one thing. Religious trauma is a very real deal for a lot of players. It's something that happens because in the real world, religions are powerful institutions that have, unfortunately, in many cases, launched massive cover-ups after abuse and scandal. Players can be pretty sensitive to this. So again, I'm just going to urge you, check in on your players, use some safety and communication tools, particularly when you get into the more odious parts of organized religion. Seriously, I think it's a nice thing to do, and it's really, really important. Again, just make sure that you're being a good person. I appreciate that about you. And lastly, I'm going to be paraphrasing some core concepts that are probably worthy of bigger videos in and of themselves in the service of making this religion video work. We are going to be covering everything from spirituality to animism to basic philosophy. And so as a result, I am going to have to take a lot of liberties with paraphrasing. I just trust that hopefully you will trust that I'm doing my best work on this front, but I want to make sure that we get it out of the way now. And lastly, I'll be discussing a lot of this because, as many of you know, I was trained as a medievalist. It's a career that I thought I was going to do, but I'm going to be approaching a lot of this with the approach of focusing on Western religion. I did include some Eastern religion and Eastern spiritualism in this as well, but I need to make that note right now because I do think it matters for the purposes of our discussion. With that out of the way, let's get our biggest misconception out of the way immediately, and that's religion and morality. Here in the West, at least, when we talk about Christianity, which does seem to be the dominant religion here in the West, there is a massive focus on its shall we say, aptitude or its use as a barometer for what is and isn't morally correct, right? That's true both for Catholicism, for Protestants, and for pretty much every Christian sect that stems out of Catholicism or the early Roman Catholic Church, right? And as useful as that can be as a framework to go through our lives, the fact of the matter is when we are talking about fantasy religions, many of them tend to hew closer to the polytheistic religions of the Greeks, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, or the East in general, or towards monotheistic religions that are based around magic and service rendered through that magic, which means they don't really have quite as much in common with the Western religions. And I think it's really important for us to talk about this because for many of those historical religions, faith in and of itself was never a question about what was right. It was the answer to questions. For example, if you're going to be like, what is going to come in the future, you might turn to a religious priest in order to find that, right? The Oracle of Delphi, people often take for granted, is a priestess of Apollo, right? Again, you're not going to the Oracle of Delphi to find out what is right or wrong. You're going to figure out if you're going to win the battle. And again, these are important questions that people would answer, and their answers were found through religion. Why do the oceans tremble? Why does the earth shake? Why is it that all of a sudden the sea that I am fishing on turns into a completely dark drink, swallows up half the people I know, and spits me out onto unknown shores? You have displeased Poseidon. That's the obvious answer to that question. Why is it that there are creatures whose existence is literally anathema to us? One bite, one nick, and all of a sudden I'm gone, or somebody that I love and treasure deeply is completely destroyed. Well, that's because Apep, who is opposed to the existence of humanity, has littered the deserts of Egypt with his minions. Why is it that I lose my child when they're young, when they have their whole life ahead of them, when they are a bright spot in my life or a bundle of joy? They don't necessarily have an answer for that question, so they blame it on Lilith. In reality, the idea of religion as a purely moral force, a right and wrong, a moral barometer, is a mostly Western phenomenon, and it's a mostly recent phenomenon in human history. You had thousands of years of human religious worship and practice where it was less about right and wrong and more about the answer to a question. Again, it's really important for us to discuss this because we need to talk about how morality does creep into religion, and really that has to do with Socrates, at least here in the West. For those of you who have been maybe living under a rock, Socrates is in many ways the founder of philosophy, if you believe he existed. There's an interesting theory that posits that maybe he is the creation of Plato and Aristotle, but I don't know if I buy that. Regardless, Socrates in Athens focuses his entire philosophical career less on solving intriguing concepts outside of the realm of morality and really focuses himself on what it is to live a just life. Prior to Socrates' existence, you had philosophers who were advisors, who were tutors, and who at many different points even became political leaders in and of themselves. We call these individuals the pre-Socratics, right? The pre-Socratics didn't care about morality, and in fact, a lot of their philosophical thinking was far more esoteric. For example, one of them posited that you can't actually go anywhere because no matter how far you are along in your journey, you're really only halfway to the next journey. Now, that's really stupid. I would probably be like, well, I'm literally able to go walk over to you and my destination is punching you in the head because that's the dumbest thing I've heard. But again, these are the kinds of things the pre-Socratics concern themselves with. Can you tell that I had to do a 16-page paper on the pre-Socratics and that I hate them so vehemently because this is a lot of, in my opinion, kind of malarkey. But again, it's important to put this into context because what made Socrates such a problem was that he was really interested in what it meant to live a good life and how we can answer the most base philosophical questions that would lead to making a good life. And indeed, Socrates' teachings give way to Stoicism. Stoicism is entirely concerned with how to live a good life. Socrates was concerned with truth, right, and thus making a good life as a result of finding truth in philosophy, but the Stoics are entirely concerned with living a good life. That is their truth. And as time continued, as time progressed, Stoicism and Stoic principles crept their way into Catholicism. The early Catholic Church, which obviously spent a lot of its time in Rome, that's where St. Peter was martyred, the first pope of the Catholic Church, spent a lot of its time in Rome, and as time develops, what happens are Stoic principles, Stoic teachings, and Stoic philosophy bleed into the Catholic teaching. When Martin Luther creates the Protestant Church and splits from the Catholic Church, inevitably triggering a, shall we say, total break of the early Christian community into what we now know as the multiple Christian sects, those Stoic ideals are baked into the DNA of the Protestants when they split from the Roman Catholics, and thus there is a little bit of that Stoic morality baked into quite a lot of those Western Christian sects. It's part of the reason that we, here in the West, consider religion to be a lens on what is and is not morally correct. This is a Western concept when we are talking about religion, and it's really important for me to bring it up now. By the way, this chart is overly simplified. There are far more different Christian and, or shall we say, Catholic sects, depending on what time in history you are looking and what schism we're talking about, but this is a pretty good overview of the types of community splintering that we're talking about. Again, when it starts with those early Christians, it creeps into the Roman Catholics and then the Protestants, and then all of those Christian sects after that. There is a little bit of Stoicism baked into all of it, whether they know it consciously or not. And again, that's an important thing for us to talk about. But with that out of the way, I want to address some key elements of good religion. And by good religion, I don't mean morally correct religion. I mean interesting, I mean intriguing, and I mean conceptually meaty religions. And that's really what I want to talk about. And the first one is that religion is vastly and deeply connected to the natural world. Part of this, I think, stems from our ability as humans to relate to the worlds around us and to take outside stimuli and experience and incorporate them into our worldview or into our belief systems. We know this is true because in prehistory, when we're digging through like a Neolithic sites, we still find early religious totems and emblems, things that are carved in the shapes of bears or trees or the sun or the moon, right? People seek answers from the natural world because when we were originally evolving, this is the first unexplainable and yet ever-present force that human beings are a part of. It goes a long way to helping explain things like totems and animism in early, and by early, I mean early human faith development, right? We are drawn to the natural world because it is ever present and because for a long time it was unexplainable. But I think it goes beyond that as well. Let's consider something like the Egyptians. This is a faith that is oft quoted, or at least oft used in media, in movies, and in television, and rightfully so. If you read the stories of the Egyptian gods, they're rife with drama and peril, with excitement, with intrigue. All of these amazing things make for great storytelling and make for great character building. It's the kind of dynamic growth that we as game masters and storytellers would slay for. But it also goes to point out the environment that they are in. The Egyptians, with their dependence on the Nile and the ever-present deserts around them, and their location as a maritime trading empire, all of those things help to gradually color their religion. And when we look at the pantheon of Greek deities, we can kind of see them as answers to the problems of somebody living in the desert. Food, fertility, storms, danger, the instability of living in that environment, the constant need to worry about the weather, or the idea that at any moment those sands could spread, wiping out crops, or taking out cities, or perhaps even forcing you away from your comfortable life. It's no secret then, in a geographic environment where things can change rapidly, the pharaohs were perhaps obsessed with building monuments that could stand the test of time. I think there's probably something there. And when you look at some of their deities, of course, those are related to, or at least answers to, those geographic concerns that are born from that region, right? Anuket is an important deity in the Egyptian pantheon because she's the deity of fertility and thus is associated with the Nile, which, if you understand Egyptian civilization, is the umbilical cord that gives life to that entire empire then and even now, if we're being completely honest. The desert, which is a force of predation in regular secular human life, it can take things away from you, destroy your crops, put you in danger, make you, perish of thirst. Of course, that is associated with a deity like Set, who is trying to bring about the ruin of mankind. These geographic concerns go on to spur the growth of the deities and the faith and the legends that surround those characters and those gods throughout Egypt's worship. If you're going to build a fantasy religion, you have to take the geographic location of its worshippers and of the deity itself, where it's chiefly located, into account. Otherwise, you are cruising for a bruising. And with that in mind, I want to introduce you to the faith of Xintraal. I thought exactly about the kind of religion I wanted to make for this video, and I thought, as a historian, or at least somebody who wanted to be a historian, there's really no better place to start than in the cradle of Mesopotamian civilization, in the humble fishing village, those tiny little ramshackle communities that are built on trust and built on the common relationship both with each other and with the sea. This is the village of Xin. As I mentioned before, it's a very humble fishing village. These are individuals who work and worship alongside a protector spirit, something that they call Xintraal. Now, the people of Xin are humble, and that's putting it mildly, right? They're subsistence fishers by trade. They occasionally will dive for oysters to help supplement their diet and, help them trade a little bit additionally. They're occasionally raided by coastal forces, but it's really nothing major. It's not major invasions, right? They'll give up a little bit of livestock. They'll occasionally lose a building or two, but for the most part, because they're so small, they really don't have the ability to do anything about it. But for the most part, they're small, they're tight-knit, and they care. They are short-distance traders and divers and fishermen. And as a result of that, the faith of Xintraal is shaped around the desires and the needs of a small fishing community. When I started to boil down what a small fishing community might need, it was pretty simple. You want food, you want good weather, and you want navigation. Those are important things for fishermen and light traders to take into account when they are making their worship. But because I really liked the feel of this community, the importance of the families, the relationships that are interwoven throughout this space, community becomes a major aspect. And again, this provides the foundation for the faith of Xintraal. I want you to keep that in the back of your mind as we continue to process this video. But one of the things that I really want to talk about is that religion develops and grows over time, right? Religion is not a static thing. A god is not birthed into the world and then left in stasis. Gods, much like the people that worship them or the civilizations that grow and develop and change, are prone to growing, developing, and changing alongside their worshippers. It is an overlooked fact that a god or gods are dynamic in nature. And there's a really big reason for this, and part of it is what we like to call syncretism, right? Now, syncretism, for those of you that might not be in the know, is kind of like an inside joke or the kind of language that you would develop alongside your friends or your family. Syncretism basically is the idea that over time, a faith will amalgamate and absorb parts of surrounding cultures or even other religions into its central canon, and over time, what was once borrowed becomes a core aspect or a core part of the faith itself. It's actually part of the reason I talked about Stoicism in terms of Western Christianity, because over the years, Western Christianity has continued to carry on Stoic tenets. That's a form of syncretism. And if you're looking at this image on the screen right now, this is an image of the Jewish deity Yahweh. But what people don't realize is that Yahweh was also a Canaanite deity as well. For a while, he was a deity of local importance, of frankly speaking, little importance in some historical records. And over time, as the worship of Yahweh grew, elements of Yahweh began to form the beginning of the Jewish faith. And as it grew and continued, it would absorb other aspects of Canaanite deities or even deities that early Jewish communities would trade with into that central Yahweh worship to, over literally thousands of years, become the idea of Jewish or Judaism that we know today. That's a really interesting thing. And the reason you might want syncretism, or you might be okay with syncretism in your faith, has to do with conversion and assimilation. It is way easier for you to convert people if there are elements of your faith that are similar to them or welcoming to them, right? It's the same reason that religious groups like cults often try to get to know somebody or try to base some of their practices around the region that they find themselves in. You are far more likely to attract individuals into your faith if there are elements of that faith worship they're familiar with, either culturally, religiously, or in the secular areas, right? You want to draw people in, and because more converts means the religion can grow and the faith can grow stronger, either, religiously, right? More people to worship what you believe is the true God, or in a perhaps more, shall we say, secular type of thinking, you have more people to draw on if things get real, or more money and more resources to pool together to continue to move. And assimilation is also an important thing, because assimilating makes it easier for you to survive and to trade. It's easier for others around you who are different to view you as a potential partner rather than a potential enemy if there are elements of shared cultural cross-pollination between your faith and religion and between the cultural practices that they have. Again, an amount of syncretism isn't just something that happens naturally in religion. It makes sense as a kind of religious defense mechanism by which a faith can grow, shift, and develop in order to do things. And also, syncretism occurs as a response to changing values, or not even just syncretism, but core shifts, dramatic shifts in an existing faith can move as a response to something changing. Let's go back to the Jewish faith, for example. During the period of Babylonian exile, after the first destruction of the Jewish temple, you have a pretty massive shift in terms of anthropology when it comes to Jewish faith and teaching. And really, what happened was, during the diaspora, the Jews were forced to come to grips with the fact that maybe, just maybe, they weren't being punished for doing something wrong, right? A lot of that early pre-Babylonian exile writing talks about God bringing his wrath down upon you because you did something wrong. However, post-Babylonian exile, it becomes, the story shifts, right? You can actually see this in the Old Testament, interestingly enough, in the ways that some of those faith stories are represented, where it's like, before, God is punishing you for doing ill, whereas post-Babylonian exile, the stories of God is testing you to see if your faith is strong, or God is your only bulwark against the horrors of the world, or God is there with you even in the trying times. Those types of stories spike as a result during this time period. Now, again, it is conjecture. I cannot say with true certainty that this is a fact. However, it does seem likely that that is part of the case, or part of the reason for a shift in those stories. And again, this makes sense as cultures grow and develop, as people shift and change. Your values and the experiences that your faithful undergo are going to result in shifts in what a faith values. If your religion is static forever, then chances are it is either going to fall by the wayside, or it's not very well constructed at all. The religions that grow, the religions that last, that stand the test of time, are the ones that adapt and adopt things around them, either as a result to major changes, like, in this case, total and complete exile, or as a result of the slow, gradual cultural cross-pollination of just existing with other people who have different viewpoints and different things that are important. And really, this is true, by the way, for even other pantheons as well, not just monotheistic religions. I'm putting up a picture of Poseidon here, but there's a lot of early writings for like chthonic faiths that basically surmise that Poseidon and Hades were at one point a joined deity, sort of, so to speak, where they kind of had, basically it was one deity who had a lot of the same, shall we say, I don't want to call it like a divine studio, but like the same divine purviews. And then over time, those things changed. And in fact, a lot of those early writings point to this sort of fused chthonic Poseidon-Hades amalgamation being the chief of the Greek pantheon during those early times, or what would be the Greek pantheon. Again, I'm paraphrasing here. However, and again, we're purely in the conjecture zone, this type of deity makes sense when Greece is a early maritime trading nation that is focused on exploring the world and trying to increase its mercantile endeavors. However, and again, we are purely in the conjecture zone here. Conjecture zone. I have to think and I have to wonder that the gradual shift towards Zeus being the chief of the Greek pantheon may have something to do with Greece's expansion from a purely mercantile and trading empire that really does a little bit of light raiding here and there on the side to a nascent political force that is going to move and shape and shake the ancient world, right? Of course, we had the one who was based on weather and the sea and death, right, as our chief deity, and now we have moved on to the political machinations and the true tyrant king god of Zeus during a time when rulership and political brinksmanship are incredibly important. Again, this is conjecture zone, but it's a really interesting parallel to think about, right? As the values of what a culture holds dear, as it starts to seize what it believes is its destiny, the core tenets of its god or gods are going to shift. And speaking of that, we have to check back in on the faith of Xintraal. You see, since the last time that you and I have checked in on this humble fishing village, they have made a incredible, a bountiful discovery. You see, while going about oyster diving, they have discovered something even more precious, a bed of pearls. These are seen as a gift from Xintraal himself, right? These are no longer something that is able to be just kept under the surface of the sea and under wraps. No, this sudden influx of massive wealth and prosperity in the village is actually directly attributed to Xintraal, and it has almost immediate, amazing knock-on effects. The first one is that immediately after this, the people of Xintraal start to use these pearls as a token of trade, and with it they're able to bring additional goods and services that they otherwise would not have been able to get when all they had to trade was oyster meat and fish. The sudden influx of pearls brings a sudden influx not just of wealth, but of new people and new ideas into what was, again, a humble fishing village before, is suddenly turned into a booming trading post overnight because of the blessing of Xintraal in the form of this massive pearl harvest. It also allows the people of Xintraal, who have been undergoing those coastal raids for quite some time, to invest in their own military. With the wealth provided by the pearls, they are able to hire hardy soldiers to help train some of them to fight. They construct ships and they go after those coastal raiders, finally putting those individuals to the sword and putting an end to what is essentially decades of on and off raids that were sort of seen as business as usual. But now, because of the blessings of Xintraal, they have been able to take up the sword and the sail and push those enemies back or completely obliterate them anyway. Finally, because of the rise of these pearl beds, Xintraal's faith begins to shift a little bit. Yes, we still care about navigation and community because we are still a village of sailors and a village of traders, but we have sort of shifted the needs of food and weather to prosperity and strength, the things that those pearls provided to the people of Xin, and again are viewed as the blessings of Xintraal himself. As a result, the divine purview of Xintraal has changed and evolved to fit the sudden influx of wealth and the changes that that wealth has brought. Now, before we move on to the next point that I want to discuss, I do want to mention one thing. Those pearl divers, who were the ones who first discovered the wealth and took the lion's share of it as the ones who found it and took the risk, donate quite a bit of those pearls to the temple of Xintraal, what was once a small ramshackle shrine. I almost called it a roadside shrine, but really it's a shoreside shrine, slowly starts to evolve into a proper temple with pearl jewelry and pearl artifacts taking on a real mechanical aspect in the worship of Xintraal. Again, they are viewed as gifts of their god, so of course they start to play a much larger role in the ceremony and the worship of Xintraal. And over the years, those pearl divers, the ones who built and got that wealth, continue to donate part of their wealth, either in the form of pearls or the sundry goods and currencies that the pearl trade gives them, to the Church of Xintraal. And I want you to keep that in your back pocket, in the back of your mind as we continue on, because that's going to have some knockabout changes as we continue to move forward. Now, you know what else shines like lustrous pearls? That's right. It's our sponsor, Tales from Elsewhere. They reached out, and again, they're sponsoring another one of our Desks and Dorks videos, and I gotta tell you, I'm incredibly happy. If you, like me, love the kind of deep, rich world building that we're talking about here, and you want to be, supportive of a 100% human-made role-playing game, I really want you to go check out their Kickstarter. It's in the link in the description below. They are so close to getting this bad boy fully funded and off the ground, and I, for one, cannot be more excited. It's got a ton of stuff that I love. One of the things that I really enjoy about the system in general is that a lot of the things that you would take into account, or would fail to take into account maybe in your character building, aren't just fuel for a backstory. They're actually mechanically part of the system, and I really, really enjoy that. I love that idea of taking the grit and the grist of the Wild West life and turning it into the kind of fuel that makes for amazing role-playing games. Also, let's be real here for a second. You know me, you know your boy loves a little bit of added historical oomph. I gotta tell you, the fact that the the menus for the actual shopkeepers are built to look kind of like basically a terrifying Weird West version of the Sears catalog fills me with a kind of joy that I cannot even begin to describe. Here's the deal. I already backed this game. You guys know at this point, we did a whole post about it before, but if I put a sponsor in the video, I've never put a sponsor in the middle of a video before. I'm only doing it if I genuinely believe that the product on hand is good, that it is made ethically, and that it is made by people who I like and respect. And I can say that all of that is true for the Tales from Elsewhere team and for the game that they have crafted. I really want to see this game succeed, which is why it is getting my first ever Desks and Dorks ad spot in the middle of a video. Again, I can do nothing else to show you how confident I am that you might like this game than by putting it right here and telling you what I'm telling you right now. So if you're in the market for a Weird West role-playing game with some teeth, some rules light fun, and just enough grit to keep you going, go to the link in the description below, check it out. Even if you can't back, check it out, follow the project, because doing that helps bump them up in Kickstarter's algorithm, and it might even put them in front of somebody who has the ability to back it. So please, if it interests you even a little bit, go and check it out. With that out of the way, let's talk a little bit more about religion. And I can think of no better place to begin our discussion once again than by talking about how the gods are in many ways walking metaphors. They are allegories for things that a society or a person values, espouses to value, or wants to be vital to its civilization as it grows, right? Shockingly enough, most of the gods aren't real. You can climb up Mount Olympus and there is nobody in a toga waiting for you. I know, that's a huge disappointment. And so, as a result though, we as game masters, as people, can look at the gods as a kind of textual analysis, as allegorical to the things that someone values. They're almost like literary devices in that respect. Let's take Zeus, for example. There's a lot of, let's be real here, really bad textual analysis of a god like Zeus, where people are like, why do people like Zeus? Why would the Greeks ever follow Zeus? Well, here's the thing, there's a lot of complex ideas about gods, but for the most part, Zeus is kind of an allegory for what a king is. In many ways, he is a great king. Zeus vanquishes a basically eldritch abomination from beyond the stars in the form of Kronos, who eats their own children to survive. He then decides to use his own family to create order from said chaos, set the order of the universe right, and bring balance not just to the realms of gods, but to the realms of man. In many ways, his victory over Kronos and subsequent stabilization of the universe is exactly what a great king would do. Conversely, the fact that he abuses his subjects, takes advantage of women, commits horrible acts of violence, atrocity, and far worse, to members of his own family, in addition to the people that are his quote-unquote worshippers / subjects, makes him the kind of tyrant king that the Greeks would be all too familiar with. In many ways, Zeus is two sides of the same coin of kingship, a tyrant and a liberator, a monster and a good monarch. What about Hades, right? Everyone's like, wow, Hades just rips Persephone away from her mother, or, Hades kind of takes advantage of all of these things in ways that feel very fickle. Like, why is he just tossing out random riddles or challenges to people like Orpheus when they descend? Well, that makes sense. Death is fickle. Death does not make sense. Whether you wind up in a nice tomb or a mass gravesite, it doesn't matter, because death takes people in their prime. Yes, Hades in a story snatches Persephone from her mother, a young woman in the prime of her life, stolen away at the worst possible moment. Gosh, I wonder what that's kind of like. It's kind of like death. Now, here's the thing though. If we're going to talk about a pantheon of gods, we should really discuss one of my favorites. If you're a longtime fan of Desks and Dorks, you know that my final project to get my history degree was me actually doing an in-depth textual analysis of the Icelandic sagas. And it's been a whole video, we haven't talked about the Norse pantheon because the Norse, great storytellers that they were, treated their gods more like allegories than anybody else. And I'll be honest, no god in the Norse pantheon does this quite as well as Odin. You see, Odin gets short shrift nowadays, where he's played beautifully by Anthony Hopkins in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, but realistically, he's kind of actually the scariest, most perverted, violent old man in all of myth and legend. Some of the stuff that Odin does makes Zeus kind of look like a Boy Scout. It's a little scary, but in many ways, Odin, the stories that surround him, elements of his worship, and parts of his quote-unquote character, if we're treating him as a literary or allegorical device, scream the very parts of the most brutal aspects of Norse culture at the time. In many ways, Odin is Norse cultural value, right? The Norse espouse an importance and a value to cunning. This is something that Odin has in spades, right? Odin is the trickster, the riddle master, the wand bearer, right? This is a guy who literally delights in the kinds of weird, like Rube Goldberg-esque schemes and pranks that either result in the destruction of entire families or the dissolvement of an entire kingdom. Cunning is kind of what Odin does. The early Norse are brutal and they pride themselves in their effective brutality, right? There is no one that is spared from a very useful raid unless they're worth a good amount of money. And when we talk about the wrath of Odin, there isn't someone, or barely anybody, I should say, in any myth or legend as brutal or as savage as Odin's wrath. Odin inflicts horrific things, like, for example, one of his quote-unquote adopted sons is a Norse king who later doesn't recognize him when Odin shows up in shape-shifting form. He chains Odin up, not realizing who Odin is, not realizing that Odin is also the guy that raised him, and Odin, to spite this man, reveals his true form, disappears, and when his adopted son tries to go and reach him to apologize, trips and impales himself on his own sword, because Odin is kind of a giant jerkbag, and in a way that is really brutal, in a way that the Norse would probably appreciate at the time. And equality, in some ways as well, is something that the Norse did, and it's something that Odin espouses. The Norse were actually really interesting in that they had pretty decent, especially by the time, were progressive views on sexuality, marriage, and relationships. The Norse had laws to protect from things like assault. They had things like actual decent divorce proceedings. And if you were a woman in some Norse tribes and Norse areas, you actually could find political and economic power in the form of the priestesshood. That's kind of awesome and very different than a lot of the cultures that surround it. But again, to the Norse, it was pragmatic. As long as you had a use, you could be, given at least a little something. And Odin is exactly like that. He doesn't care if you're the ugliest dwarf ever or the dumbest troll. As long as you play within his plans or contribute, yeah, he'll give you some modicum of equal treatment. And this kind of reflects the sort of, not laissez-faire, but almost violent egalitarianism that you see in some Norse societies. It's very strange. But lastly, Odin is nothing but ambitious, and this crops up more than anything in Norse myth and legend. We are talking about a god who sacrifices his eye in order to gain the ability to see the future, who literally destroys himself on the branches of Yggdrasil in order to gain the actual aspect of magic. This is the tamest illustration of Odin's sacrifice that I can find, and it's actually really cool looking too, to be honest, which is pretty sweet. But again, all of these things that we associate with Odin are, to the Norse, what makes an ideal Norseman, right? Odin is indicative of the national cultural character of the Viking people at a certain time. He's almost like a snapshot of their cultural values and the things that matter most to them. And in that way, Odin, like many gods, can be seen not just as a divine body, but as allegory, and if we as game masters and storytellers consider our gods as allegories for civilizations, for people, for cultures, what we are going to be getting is something far more rich and far more entertaining for both ourselves and our players. And that, my good friends, makes gods like Odin kind of the best. And now that we've talked a little bit about the gods as allegory, let's check on how the faith of Xintraal is slowly developing. Now, you see, after we have left our friends on the pearl beds, the faith of Xintraal has reached a kind of crossroads. You see, on the one hand, their small fishing village has now, because of the prosperity that has been reaped over those hundreds of years, it has turned into a trade empire. It is a hub for seafarers, traders, merchants, and adventurers of all stripes, and as a result, wealth has poured steadily into their coffers. The mother of pearl vestments have sort of taken on a color and life of their own, practicing in both white or shades of white gold, and they are protected by the knights of Xintraal, essentially men and women who decorate their armor with mother of pearl inlay, who venture out to fight against sea creatures and seafaring raiders of all stripes. Now, with this massive influx of wealth and privilege, you would think everything is going really well, and for those at the top, it absolutely is. And you may have noticed that our depiction of Xintraal has changed a little bit, and it's going to keep changing as the video progresses, right? Xintraal now no longer resembles the half fish, half man, or crab head that he did earlier, but he's more of a lord, more of a man about the sea, shall we say. And yes, I'm aware that this is a mosaic of Poseidon, but just, bear with me. Now, with this being said, though, there's a new sort of mythos, a kind of epithet. Instead of saying something like amen, the faithful and the protectors of Xintraal simply say, Xintraal provides. He has provided us with the mother of pearl that allowed us to build a trade empire. He has provided us with wealth and status, and as a result, we venerate him. So, to those people, to the wealthy, the powerful, those in the immediate inner circle, or the descendants of those original pearl divers and priests, Xintraal provides. But as the great religious scholar, the notorious B.I.G. once said, "Mo money, mo problems," and despite the wealth and privilege that are flooding into the city like the very tides themselves, there are still those suffering from poverty and those who remember their more humble beginnings. You see, even though the priesthood of Xintraal has continued to grow in strength, in its efforts to grow, it has often left behind some of its most vulnerable. Now, this isn't to say that the priesthood is corrupt or that the members of the Knights of Xintraal aren't interested in protecting the lower class. Far from it. It just means that as the organization has grown and as its obligations have swelled, so too has it slowed down. In fact, in many ways, it wants to render aid, but is unable to do so quickly or efficiently because of the layers of bureaucracy that have slowly been added. Remember, they're still beholden to the wealthy now, at least in some way, shape, or form, no matter how well-intentioned those wealthy might be. And so to some, to the lower class, to those in more vulnerable sections of the city, it's not that Xintraal provides, it's that Xintraal ponders. This has become an epithet to them. It's almost like a very dark, nihilistic version of we'll see. Are we ever going to get that food or that medicine? Well, Xintraal ponders. Are we ever going to get additional help against these small raids that are starting to incur on the sections of the city that are less defended and, we don't have the time to react to it? Well, Xintraal ponders. We don't know, and frankly speaking, in many ways, we've kind of given up hope that it will change. Here's the thing, though. To these people, to the individuals who are starting to feel a little left behind, Xintraal doesn't look like a version of Poseidon. Xintraal looks like the ghost of an old fisherman, or sometimes even just a hooded figure on a dock or a beach, enjoying the simple pleasures that they used to enjoy in Xin. A simple life of subsistence fishing, and if you see a lone hooded figure off in the distance on the shore, and then you look back and they're gone, it might not be someone going for a swim or an early morning oyster dive. It might truly be Xintraal themselves. And these people, the downtrodden, not downtrodden, but those feeling a little more left behind, have begun to take up defense of themselves instead of waiting for the Knights of Xintraal or the priests to do something about it. And they have done so with oar and harpoon, with fishing spear and pearl diving dagger. They are going to protect themselves, and no longer do they think of Xintraal as a kind of economic provider. To them, Xintraal protects, and this statement, said by these members of the faithful, isn't just an acknowledgement of their god, it is an acknowledgement that, to them, the protection of the community is a responsibility of the community, in a way that harkens back to the early days when Xin was just a simple fishing village. Now, I want you to keep this in mind as we continue on in our discussion, because what we've done as game masters, as storytellers, is set up two distinct social groups who are still interconnected by their worship, but are now starting to veer in different ways, not just in terms of their goals, but culturally, as the visions of Xintraal and the things that those visions of Xintraal provide are now allegorical for the ways that these two different cultural groups are beginning to see themselves, and that's really truly where the God as allegory kind of shines through. We'll go back to Xintraal in a little bit, but before we talk about that, I want to address another important thing for those of you who want to design your own gods, and that's deities can grow and change. Now, I've talked about this earlier, right? Deities are dynamic. When I say grow and change, I don't mean like their purview shifts. I mean they are literally reabsorbed and destroyed and turned into a new god. This happens, by the way, with Persephone. We've talked about Persephone a couple times in the video, and you might be familiar with her as the kind of flowery, nature-loving child of Demeter. Here's the thing. I mentioned how many of the Greek pantheon changed and shifted when there was early Chthonic days, and Persephone had very little to do with nature. In fact, in the early days, she looked a lot less like this and a lot more like this. Persephone's name, Perispoina, which I think I am saying correctly, when loosely translated, essentially means the dread one, or the one that we don't refer to. In some cases, her name is omitted or struck down, so Perispoina is actually kind of the last remaining vestige of what we think her name was, because the Greeks were so terrified of her, or not, they weren't Greeks at that point, but the early Greeks were so terrified of her that they just didn't even want to address the fact that she existed. That's kind of an issue, and weirdly enough, when our Hades Poseidon fusion deity that I mentioned earlier in the video, when they split off into their own unique things, Perispoina, or Persephone, a lot of her purview over death gets shifted to Hades, which is really intriguing and really interesting. So depending on the world that you build, the faiths that are present, and how active and evocative you want to be, or you want your players to be, with elements of faith in your games, it is entirely possible for gods to be struck down, reborn, and reforged into entirely new divine entities. This is far more common historically than I think most people even realize, and I think that's really interesting, and it brings us back to the faith of Xintraal. And we're going to go we're going to keep skipping a couple hundred years every single time, because that early schism, that tiny little splinter in the shared culture and history of Xintraal, has in that time period festered and become something truly horrific. The members of the priesthood and some of the members of the Knights of Xintraal have at this point in the city's history succumbed to their greed and their wanton desire for wealth, opulence, and power above all else, and usually at the expense of the working class. As wealth disparity has continued to shift, people have not shifted away from the worship of their Xintraal, but they have shifted away from the worship of what they refer to as the priests' Xintraal. And unfortunately, for those priests, many of the members of the clergy and many of the members of the Knights of Xintraal have sort of taken stock of the situation. They've taken a good hard look at themselves, and instead of staying, they went with the people, which means that you have an entrenched, powerful group against another group who is less entrenched but now has the backing and power of individuals with some real clout and authority. And what this means is we have a full-blown, full-blooded civil war. This war, this conflict, the battle for the city of Xin, actually winds up bringing the entire thing into flames. The city is reduced to cinders, and its massive shipping fleet, caught in the harbor, unable to be unmoored during the initial outbreak of fighting, burns like tinder on the waves. Here's the knock-on effects of this. If you want to use the faith of Xintraal in your campaign world, Xintraal and their faith no longer exist in the way that we've known it. As those two groups split away from one another, both geographically and ideologically, so too does Xintraal, the deity, split. The priests choose to remain in the city, unable to let go of their wealth, which they think they can, maybe recapture from the waves or rescue from the smoldering ruins of their once great metropolis. They venerate Xin. Xin is a massive, avaricious sea serpent, a beast of greed and just pure appetite. Xin takes on a bunch of different forms, but as always, it is the inky black monster under the waves, always whispering to people that there's just something else beneath the surface that's worth risking it for. Now, navigation and prosperity from the original worship of Xintraal continue to be a part of this deity's purview. However, it has now been replaced by that cultural history and identity. Ambition and efficiency at all costs are now key aspects of its worship and are critical to both its priesthood and its teachings. Traal, on the other hand, is the god of those who have moved beyond the city, the descendants of those who chose to dissent. Traal appears in many ways as a sort of strapping man clad in mother-of-pearl armor, and again, navigation and prosperity remain from that original divine portfolio, right? You are going to continue to have these because these are still coastal-dwelling people with a shared maritime history. However, in place of ambition and efficiency, community and protection are going to be key and critical to the worship of Traal, because in many ways, those values are what help to get that people through that fight. Both factions still exist within our world. They are still at, maybe not even a stalemate necessarily, but they've all lost their homeland, their wealth, their power, their status on the international stage. Kind of like many other empires and their pantheons that have gone before them in our world, in the real world. But elements of that original faith, that shared history, and how those deities grew and developed remains in the worship of both Xin and Traal. And I really think what we've done is we've made something that is not only kind of evocative and interesting, but echoes a lot of the same religious trends that would have occurred historically. But let's say that you don't necessarily have all of the time in the world. You have like maybe 5 minutes before your game starts, or if you're like me and you just don't prep at all, maybe you want some kind of way to make your gods interesting on the fly. And for that, my friends, I still have you covered, because in order to do that, what you have to do is give your god a core. And what I mean by a core is I really want you to delve into the heart of what makes your god or your religion, your faith in your game really start to pop, really start to come alive. And what I mean by that is I want you to focus on a single emotion or a single attribute that is core to your god and make it unique to all the other cores of all the other gods or goddesses in your setting, period. Like, what I mean by that is, let's think of Zeus, right? When I think of Zeus, I don't think of his kingship, I think of pride, right? Zeus is willing to do anything, say anything, and be anything because in his mind, Zeus is the greatest, right? Again, even his relationship with someone like Heracles, his greatest son, and arguably the most famous, at least in the modern era, hero of Greek myth and legend, is entirely based on pride. Zeus doesn't care what happens to Herc's family. Zeus could care less about all of the anguish that poor man went through, so long as Herc keeps stacking up bodies and taking out monsters, it, continues to boost his legacy. So it matters. So pride is what I think of for Zeus. Or Hades, for example, is a character that is driven, yes, by the insane wealth and the insane power of the underworld, but ultimately when I look at the stories of Hades, the sacrifices that he has to make, the sheer amount that he has to do just to keep the realm of the underworld afloat, I think of crushing responsibility. Or maybe if you're thinking about Odin, right? Odin has all of these insane stories, but whether he's duping the giants out of land, or discovering the secrets of magic, or learning how to see into the future, almost everything Odin does seems to be centered around raw ambition. This, at least in my mind, are the core of these gods. So when you're making a core, you want to make it unique, and again, you want it to be an emotion, something a player can glom onto if they want to be a follower or a devotee of this god, or if they want to be an enemy. Let's take a look at one of our gods. We're just going to say this is a god of community. Also, by the way, I call them cores, but in a lot of ways too, they act kind of like tree trunks. Planting a pantheon is a lot like planting a forest in a way that will make sense in about 2 seconds. But we're going to start off with one of our gods, and their core is community. And if we start thinking about community and what a good community looks like, or an important community looks like, we're going to start adding branches to that, right? We might include things like education, because of course we want to educate members of our community to make them better. Language, how better to allow more into the fold than by learning how to better communicate with them verbally. Or things like cooking and hospitality. If we're going to make a community, we might want to welcome people into the fold with a warm meal and a safe place to rest their head. All of these could fall under the divine portfolio of a god of community. But let's compare it to another god. What if, for example, we have a god of knowledge, and what might go into a god of knowledge but ambition and curiosity, two things that someone in the pursuit of knowledge is almost always going to want. But education will similarly be continuing to be an important aspect here. Now, what I think, and what I know actually is important with this method, is that you want to have no bleed over between the cores of these gods, but you want some bleed over in the portfolios, right? In this way, the gods are interconnected because they're going to either work together in some areas, or they'll clash in areas that they might coexist in because there are differences in their core. For example, if we compare a god whose purview is knowledge first, but whose elements include education, ambition, and curiosity, that god is willing to do just about anything to make knowledge happen, even at the cost of individuals around them, because to that deity and their followers, it is the education, the knowledge that is important, not necessarily the community. But although education is a primary, pattern or a primary part of the portfolio for our community-based god, they're not going to do that. These relationships are going to be centered less on sacrifice for the greater knowledge or the greater good, greater power, so to speak, and more on how do we facilitate the passage of knowledge on to members of our community. That's a way that you can create a core for a deity that still has matching portfolios with other gods. So there's elements of conflict and cooperation already set up between your faiths. I think that's the best way to do it, and it's the way that I have been running gods in my games for pretty much ever. But as we wind down our video, there are two really important things that I want to mention while I've got you all here. And the first one is a question that has popped up continually, both in the Discord and when I announced the video, which is, would the gods even exist holistically or historically when they have real, tangible power? And the answer to that question, I think, is worthy of a whole video in and of itself, but this is already entirely very long. And I do think the answer is yes, they absolutely would, because we know what it's like when there are two basically world-altering, world-ending level superpowers. You see, as amazing as the gods are, they act kind of like nation-states, right? Obviously, they have vast divine power and ability, but that also means that every other god has vast divine power and ability. So if you start pulling out your, biggest trump card all of a sudden, that means the other gods can do it too, and you can get faded at a moment's notice, which means I really do think that the gods would mostly let mortals or mortals with their blessings kind of duke it out, because then you can have what is essentially a Cold War proxy war with people armed with the divine blessing. So it stops fighting like, gods battling it out over mountains, and more like moving around pieces on a board, trying to get things to be the way that you want them to be. And I think that's kind of how it would work. And finally, a question that has come up a couple times, both in our Discord and again when I was, doing the script for this, is how do you handle people who don't believe in gods in a setting where gods are real and offer tangible powers, tangible benefits? And ultimately, I think the answer is that non-belief in and of itself is real power. And I have to talk about one of my favorite characters ever, Diomedes of Argos. Diomedes of Argos is, in many ways, the single scariest Greek hero ever. He might be the single scariest hero in myth, next to Sun Wukong. Like, I don't think people understand when you read the Iliad, the person who sent the most Trojans back to Lobby wasn't Achilles, it was Diomedes. Diomedes was so scary, the gods were afraid of him. And although he's technically blessed by Athena, she gives him a shield that shoots fireballs, I kind of like to think of Diomedes as one of the few gods who doesn't actually, or not gods, but people who doesn't really care about the gods, and that non-belief, I think, gives him power. Legitimately, at one point during the Iliad, he cuts a path through the Trojans, basically to get to Paris, fights Paris, is going to completely and totally unalive Paris, and then Paris gets saved by Aphrodite, and Aphrodite's like, listen, dumb mortal, you need to leave this alone. And he goes, excuse me, who are you? I don't care about ever getting laid again, and decides to beat the brakes off of Aphrodite. And then Aphrodite, so scared, so sad, realizes, oh, I'm gonna, get crushed by this dude. And she calls upon Ares to go, save her. Because, of course, why not? When your boyfriend's the god of war, let's, get him to stop them. Again, her boyfriend is the god of war. The thing that Diomedes is doing. And Ares goes, yo, dog, you can't do this. And Diomedes goes, I'm Diomedes. I've never ducked a fade of Argos. I can do whatever I want. Ares strikes him blind, and then he proceeds to go Uno reverse card and beat the brakes off of Ares. I don't think Diomedes recognized the existence of the gods at all. Or if you want to look at it another way, there's some sort of real pleasure, I think, in playing a character whose only ability is hands in a world where people have magical powers. Seriously, like, look at Rock Lee from Naruto. In a world where everyone is like Ninja Jesus, the idea that this kid only has two powers and they are punch and kick is amazing. If you're going to put things in your games like, real divine power, I genuinely think you need to give people who don't believe in the gods a similar sort of power as Rock Lee has, where you can't do a lot of the cool stuff, but with a lot of hard work, effort, and high risk, you can absolutely go nuts. Because I don't know if it's just me or a certain generation of people who grew up watching Toonami, but watching this guy literally team up against people with unbelievable reality warping powers and win is nuts. This guy squared up with a dude who is literally Sand Satan and just said, actually, the most powerful thing is not the power of friendship, it's the power of fist. And I absolutely love that. Seriously, if you've never watched the Rock Lee versus Gaara fight, I think it actually illustrates the idea of playing someone who doesn't believe in the divine, and still is willing to square up with the divine beautifully. That's how I would suggest running it in your games, and I think it matters a ton. But with that out of the way, my friends, we are finally at the end of today's video. If you liked this video took an exorbitant amount of effort to make. Why not consider joining our Patreon? It's $3 a month if you want early access to content, or $10 a month if you want a free game. not, I guess not a free game, you pay for the game. If you want a game that is unique and I make it for you every month, you should do that. If you want to really support us though, physical copies from Tabletop Bookshelf or Indie Press Revolution. You can also get digital copies over at itch.io. But mostly, thank you for watching if you have made it to the end of this. Thanks for doing all the YouTube stuff, the like, the share, the comment, the subscribe. It really does help out. But sincerely, thank you for watching this video. This was a very, very long effort video, and hopefully you enjoyed it. Even if this does not do well, which I think it will do well, I'm really happy. This is like one of my top 5 videos I've ever made. This was a blast and a half. Thanks for taking that ride with me, everybody. And before I say goodbye to you, I do want to thank all of our amazing patrons and YouTube members: Dionysus, Chris Bates, Agile Monk, Aiden Delaney, Brian, Corbino the Great, Solution, Alex.vksh, Papa Dinosaur, Chromatic Orbital Strike, Chris Mayer, Darth, Gaming Gamison, Ro.kn, Commander Unidentified, Arcane Bard, Stefan Brissot, Darjeeling Trailblazer, Michael Torres, and David Z. You're all absolutely amazing. And those of you watching, you guys are awesome. And I'm Kyle for Desks and Dorks, and I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.